We will now go to Florida and to Switzerland to join our next two speakers to talk about trends and investments in the cultural and creative industries. Good morning, Vincent Borel. You are in Florida. You're Vice President and General Manager of the Streamers and Creators Business Group at Logitech. You are an innovator and you are a privileged observer of new trends. And also in Switzerland, hello, Ian Stewart. You are in Switzerland. Like I said, you have an incredible CV that goes from being an Olympic athlete to co-founding the seminal Wired magazine, as well as founding Aztec Internet, a leading internet business consulting firm, just to name a few of your achievements. And also present should be, I hope anyways, Valentin Michelot, a scientific contributor from the University of Lausanne, who will gather all the questions from people online that you may have for Ian and Vincent. So I encourage you to send them, because we will have quite a bit of time at the end of their presentations to take your questions. But first, we will hear from Vincent and Ian. Ian, I can see you now, so let's start with you. You have more of an overview of the sector from an investor's point of view.
I do. Excuse me. Let me just make sure this camera works. Great, we're up. Hello, everybody, and thank you for being here. This is traditionally called the graveyard slot because everybody's just had lunch and people tend to fall asleep. So Vincent and I will do our best not to let you fall asleep. I've been, I guess, investing in the creative sector, or the creative industries as we used to call it, since 1988, when I ran a fund for the Pearson Media Group, the owners of the FT, The Economist, Addison Wesley, Penguin Books, and so on, based at Lazard Ventures in London, in the city of London. So what we did at the time was invest in digital companies that were replacing or posing threats to Pearson's existing traditional media businesses. So the notion of disruption in media, the notion of digital changes in the way the creative sector work have been around since 1988. This is not new. So I have that history in the space. After that, obviously, I started Wired magazine with some friends in San Francisco. I also invested in Douglas Adams' entertainment company, the author of Hitchhiker's Guide. We created a game called Starship Titanic, which did reasonably well, 180,000 purchases of the game in the first year, but not enough to create a series. And then, of course, sadly, Douglas passed away. For now, probably the single most interesting space for a media investor, for a cultural industry or a creative industries investor, is probably the game sector. So I'll talk a little bit about that. There are lessons for different parts of it. One thing I'll say overall, though, and it characterized many of the we saw in 1988 and have continued to see ever since, is that often ideas for what might be possible in a creative setting outpace the capacity of the technology to actually do it. So I remember, for example, way back in 88, 89, visiting a virtual reality company way back in 88 and 89 in Bristol in the UK. And they had some very clever interaction ideas. They had some really quite advanced thinking about what might be possible in a metaverse environment. But everything was done in simple linear polygons because the technology at the time wasn't sufficient to generate even decent 2D images, forget about 3D. And therefore the ambitions of the company were in advance of what the technology could do. You also see the reverse. I also see companies still today terribly excited about how amazing the graphics are on a new technology, how able they are to generate great visuals or generate great interaction, but they're lacking on the story side, on the interaction side, on their understanding of what games players or an audience for an entertainment product are interested in. And I think that makes a difference. You've got to work on both. The technology has to be ready, but you can't just be in love with your technology, assuming that because the technology is cool, that everybody will love your product. The second four things I want to say is that right now, obviously within the games industry, the sector has radically changed from when I was investing in standalone games on a platform which you then paid for and then bought and then used online as long as you wished for. Now, of course, much of it is online, much of it is subscription-based, a lot of it is free, and business models include purchasing items within games and/or sometimes paying to advance if you aren't able to manage to get through the levels yourself. So a lot of the technology that we're seeing today is changing again the entertainment sector online. Crypto, of course, is part of that. I was speaking to a games developer in Scotland this week about how, for him and for his team, the arrival of payment for items in games is anathema. They don't like it. They just want to play the games. They don't want money to get involved. And yet, I've also spoken to many providers of crypto-based lists of items and or single items. Some of them are trying to do it cross-platform, cross-game series. And of course, for them, it's an entire industry and an entire development. So there's a lot going on, which makes it very, very interesting. And I think as an investor, we spend our time trying to focus on understanding where the business models will go and who's likely to pick things up and what the uptake will be like. The third thing I wanted to say of my four things as an introduction is that although I've been talking about computer games in the last 2 minutes, the idea of the metaverse is now everywhere. So the idea of being in different environments for experiences exists everywhere. I'm currently advising a museum in the United States on what relevance they have outside of the city in which they're based and how they can relate to metaverses in other people's environments to see if they can serve different audiences. Obviously, the arrival of this big push into screen-based interaction over the last 18 months means that more and more people are interested, and so the competition for that will be fierce. But I love the fact that I'm now working for a museum that I've never been to, for people I've never met, talking to them about how they might interact with people they don't know and they've never met in countries outside where the museum is. That's metaverse, and the lessons they're learning come from computer games. A lot of the interaction paradigms that we see in games are starting to be thought about and applied for within non-games metaverse ideas. The last thing I'll say is, as an intro, is that the other thing we're carefully watching these days, of course, is China. China, over the last few weeks, has decided they want to restrict the number of hours that anybody under 18 can play games. Two things about that. One, I don't know how they're going to enforce that. I don't know if you tried to control a teenager and keep him away from his games console, but it's pretty hard. I think what they're going to do is they're going to talk to Tencent and the other games providers and try and make them actually monitor times on screen. So if you're a kid in China, you're going to have to create 3 or 4 different identities so that you can go from one to the other and get 4 or 5 times your 3 hours rather than the 3 hours the country wants to limit you to. The second part of that, of course, is that the computer games industry is over 30%. I've seen some numbers as high as 40% of global gaming revenues. If China chops that off, that's a big deal for gaming companies. And it may also be a big deal for Vincent because he's providing ancillary products for the gaming industry. And the last thing is, the people I spoke to earlier this week in the games company in Scotland, they're all gamers. They started as gamers. It's how they became in love with the whole sector and the industry. It's how they got into coding in the first place because they tried to code their own games. If the Chinese government blocks crypto as it has done and gaming, I think they're shooting themselves in the foot because that's where an awful lot of people who are starting and developing the companies of the future are getting their education, and it doesn't come from school and it doesn't come from university. So kids playing with crypto online, kids playing with games online is how people start. And I think that's going to be very interesting to watch as we go forward. Other than that, thank you, Muriel, for hosting, and thank you, Natalie and Patrick, for having us here. And I look forward to hearing what Vincent has to say.
Okay, so we'll take questions. I'm sure there will be some questions for you, Ian, in a little while, but first we're going to hear from Vincent. So Vincent, you're more sort of a hands-on person in your position at the Streamers and Creators Business Group at Logitech. So what is your point of view on the trends in this sector?
Good morning or good afternoon for those in Istanbul. Well, I'm very happy to be here. I'm gonna try and share my screen so I can show some visuals. Let's see if this will pull up, and I'll talk a little more. There's definitely, from what Ian was talking about, whether it's gaming, the metaverse, and kind of these massive shifts in the economy, some really interesting trends that are happening and opportunities for us as Logitech, but I think for many players. So let me try and see if this will load. Maybe, no. Try again. Share.
Joys of technology.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll do without the screen share because I don't want to lose everybody's time. So a couple of things. So the first one is and one area that I'm particularly interested in is when you think about media, and Ian touched on, the world of media and its evolution. And I think we are living something that's pretty unique at the moment, and we might not all realize it, but there was a world in the past where you had a few large media companies that would reach the mass of people on Earth that had TVs, and they controlled the information. They controlled what would be distributed, and gradually you had more and more channels to choose from, but the companies that were behind them were still a limited few. What's happened over the last few years and has been accelerating exponentially is the fact that you now have millions of creators who are catering to billions of people. And this may seem like a cliche, but it's actually driving a fundamental shift in our economy. And this is why I get really excited. You probably all know Charlie Chaplin. And when you think of him, he's been the icon of kind of the first movies and TV. How many of you know Cabby Lane?
I don't.
All right. Well, Cabby Lane is actually a Senegalese Italian factory worker who got laid off at the beginning of COVID. And he decided to go back to his parents' home in an apartment and started making TikToks. And today he's amassed more than 100 million followers on TikTok in the past 18 months. He's gone from factory worker to mass influencer, and he doesn't speak a word. It's all memes. And he's created such a trend and a following behind him that he has now all sorts of brands and is making obviously way more than he did before COVID. Now, why am I telling you about this? Because if you think about the wave and how the world has been evolving over the last 3 or 4 decades, it's really been driven by one thing, one underlying thing that's actually influenced all of us, which is the internet. We had the first wave of the internet when information was king and people talked about the information technology, and you could go and access any information. You didn't need to go to a library. And then you had kind of the second wave where you had the Facebooks and the other platforms that emerged and became, a massive phenomenon, and not just our ability to consume the content, any content, but to connect with people. And it created a whole group of new platforms that provided a great deal of different services, but really, in essence, allowed us to connect with each other. And we have now emerged into a new wave, the third wave. Some people call it the creator economy, others call it the ownership economy. And what's interesting is, and the reason why you're having folks like Cabby Lane emerge and actually become these massive influence, is you have now a network that connects people. You have a network that allows you to efficiently distribute this information and this rich content. But the most important thing is you now have the ability as an individual to reach those people, share your message, but now you can also monetize it. You actually have the ability to create transactions. And that's really fascinating. And so what this allows, if the early days of the internet was putting some random information, but most of it was related, most of the money was made from advertising and e-commerce, you now have a new generation and kids, the Gen Zers, as we call them, that were born in this world are not only used to liking and sharing content, they create content, and they create content to share their passion. They create content to share an interest with an audience. It could be their friends, and some of them get really into it and they grow their audience. And as they grow this audience, they have this amazing ability now to start monetizing their audience directly. And this has been made possible because, as large companies, including Logitech and many others, we've used influencer marketing over the last 10, 15 years. It's become a buzzword probably over the last 5 years or so, where every company realized that to reach people on the market, you're better off going and talking to those creators who had catered to a very engaged community to get them to share your message, present your ideas and products. And now those very same influencers are actually becoming owners. They're owners of their business, the business of one. And this is a fundamental shift. So if you had big corporations, 50 years ago that became these really big entities with many, many people working for them. And then you had the startups that kind of emerged and started to displace those large corporations and challenge them, thanks to investments from VCs and others. Now you have this economy where people, individual, get to grow an audience the size of a country or two countries or three countries. Potentially, some of them will become the largest country in the world in terms of their audience reach. And they can do all of that by monetizing and engaging directly with that audience with no middleman. And so this is creating a fundamental shift, because not all of those creators today, actually a very small portion of them, are able to monetize to make it a full-time gig, but many of them are aspiring to get there. And Cabby Lame is a great example of the opportunity that's out there. And so if you think that maybe a few years ago kids would dream of becoming astronauts or becoming the next startup, today the dream of many kids and the younger generation is, how do I become a creator on my own terms, with my own audience, where I decide what I want to do, when I want to do it, and what I decide to monetize. So, when we look at this market, the really fascinating shift that's been happening is it actually touches almost every sector in the economy, but also many different types of folks. And so you'll take a journalist, maybe in the past they would go and work for the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or Wired. And today that very same journalist could decide to write a newsletter, use a platform like Substack, and build a subscriber base. And if they get 1,000 people to pay them $10 a month, they make $10,000 a month. And that's doing the thing that they want to do, writing the articles they want to write. And so there's a whole new kind of almost like breaking down of the way things have been happening. And it's happening really, really fast and in the background. Now, as this is shaping, obviously there's a lot of things at play. Media has always worked and been driven by advertising. The advertising dollars still represent a massive part of this ecosystem, but gradually you're starting to see those big platforms, Facebook and others, starting to pay attention. They've been relying on those creators to attract audiences, to drive engagement, but they were really catering to the viewers and the advertisers. The advertisers because they were the one funding the money, the viewers because they need the viewers in order to give the stats for the advertisers to pay. And the creators were kind of the third wheel, in this pair. And now, as this creator economy is rising, there's new platforms emerging that have been designed not to use the creators, but to serve the creators and serve them in a way that actually values their creativity and their uniqueness. And so I think, as maybe as a last thought, as you think about the space, what's fascinating to me is this transformation that we're living today is probably putting art, creativity at the very center of our world. So as computers and other things have become more and more efficient at doing things, have become more and more powerful at computing and connecting us, there is now kind of this emergence of the value of creativity and art coming through. And you see it, with NFTs and other things. Ian talked about the metaverse. There is a world, and it may seem really odd to many people today, where you're like, why would I buy this digital thing? And why would that be compared to this physical equivalent that we know, which could be a very nice painting or something else? But to this new community, to this new world, this is what art looks like potentially. This is how I own and transact the value of something that was created by someone.
Okay, thank you, Vincent. Maybe I would like to have Ian respond to your words. To go a little bit further about what you said, there was a recent survey that found that more American kids wanted to be a YouTube star. 29% wanted to be a YouTube star, and only 11% wanted to be an astronaut. So should we worry about that, Ian?
Yes and no. Yes, because I'm not one of those people who's been criticizing either Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk for trying to pay for rockets to go to the moon rather than pay to support charities, because I think a lot of the development that takes place when you try difficult technological adventures, of course, feed back into developments that then all of us benefit from. So I think anything which pushes people to try something extreme in technology is good for everybody. But no, that doesn't mean everybody has to be an astronaut. I worry a little bit about the social media side. I agree with Vincent that we have this plethora, this multitude of new creators coming up. I guess my only concern, and I should say here that I started as a photographer, although I did computer science and mathematics at university. My first life as a paid individual was as a photographer. I did books and magazine articles for 10 years as an editorial photographer. It's extremely hard to make money as an independent creator today. Of those millions of people, millions of creators that Vincent mentioned, most of those millions, and I would say 99.99%, are making no money or very little money. And it's a very small percentage that generate some money. The principal money is being made by the platforms, not the creators. And it was ever thus. It's just that it's different people who own the platforms now. Instead of being publishers or broadcasters, it's now the people who own the digital platforms. I agree, though, that one of the things that Vincent didn't mention, but I sometimes talk about when I'm trying to help media companies, today's media companies, survive disruption, is that there are now many, many choices for a good journalist, a good writer, a good photographer, a good graphic artist. They don't have to get a job at Wired or the New York Times anymore. They can either go on Substack on their own, or there's a multitude of online outlets for people who are able to work in a commercial environment. But for the bulk of people on the social media, I think the challenge is that they don't make money. And I think that the platforms win and the individual creators don't very much. So if I was going to encourage children or young adults who are thinking about a career and deciding between being an astronaut or being a creator either on YouTube or any of the other platforms, I'd say do some business courses first and try and work out what your business model is. This has always been the case, right? In the history of the creative sector, if you didn't understand the business model, you can't make money. If all you can do is draw or create or write, then someone else is going to make the cash and you're not. So you do need to understand business. One last thing on this. I was on, one of the reasons I got invited onto the board at University of the Arts London was I used to complain for years that the students that were coming out of Central St. Martin's or Camberwell or London College of Fashion were very good creatives, but they didn't have a clue what the business world was like. They didn't know how to work with clients. They didn't know how to work to a deadline. They didn't know how to create a portfolio. They didn't know how to sell themselves. And so I pushed for years to include some understanding of how the world works. And by the way, that's changing, as Vincent quite rightly says, monthly at the moment, never mind annually. If the young would-be workplace inhabitant is deciding between one sector and another, we need to add a little bit of business understanding to it to make sure that they generate money for themselves. I'm a little worried that the creatives are being taken advantage of today just as much as they used to be. And I, as an investor, spend my time trying to evolve business models with creative teams so that we can find a way for them to monetize what they do. But apart from that, I agree with Vincent. He paints a very clear picture of the open field that it is now for anybody to enter. And I think that's super cool. But I'd like more of them to be making money.
I'm going to see if there are any questions for you. We're going to start maybe here in Istanbul in the audience. There are some people with microphones who can come near you if you have a question that you would like to ask. Is there anybody here with a question? No. So we will go to Valentin. Do you have any questions for us from our online viewers?
Yes, we do actually have a question from Anastasia, who says, I quote, "Thank you so much for this conversation. Ian said that among creative industries, many investors are interested in gaming, and this is understandable. However, inside CCI, there is also culture, a more traditional sector with projects oriented for museums, theaters, and artists. How about this area? Do investors find them attractive? Do you notice the interest of investors in the cultural sector? And in particular, she is referring to technological projects for the cultural sector, such as startups focused on working with museum collections and artists."
Shall I have a go at that first? Okay.
You can answer, Ian.
All right. So the answer is a subtle answer. It involves aspects to it. So within the sector for the venture capitalists, the private equity investors, the traditional for-profit investors, they're going to aim at the sectors they think are going to give them the biggest return. They're going to go for the areas where there's a clear revenue stream and a route to the revenue stream and a reasonable percentage of the bottom line. Remember that even for the most sophisticated investors on Sand Hill Road, that's just outside of San Francisco, or on the East Coast of the United States, it's only 1 in 10 of their companies actually make lots of money. The other 90%, 3 will probably do okay, and probably 6 will either do nothing or fail. So they need a big hit somewhere, and they will tend to aim for big hits, and they always think that everything they invest in is a big hit. So in answer, the straight, non-politically correct but honest answer to the question is, if your project sounds like it's going to make a lot of money, you will get investment. If it doesn't, you won't from that audience. Now, there are a range of people, on the other hand, whether I've been involved, whether it was with the funds I was involved with or whether it's my own capital, in my head, I allocate for-profit, but not likely to make much money, but is likely to be a good contributor to society. And then there's the non-profit, and the money's not coming back, but it might be good for society. So there are pockets of money everywhere, quite strong in Switzerland, by the way, but also on the East Coast of the United States, a little less on the West Coast, where you can find people interested in new digital culture projects. I know, for example, a friend of mine, Andres Santo, who is a consultant for the creative sector, museums and the art sector more than the gaming sector in the US. And he knows of a number of people who are putting money into cultural projects. By the way, some of this money comes from cities and countries. As countries realize that there are changes taking place, as people start to question the relevance of museums and traditional arts institutions in the current world, and they're looking to place some of their allocated public capital into projects that are more relevant to the younger audiences. So there is money available. You have to work out where they are, but it won't be in the same pockets that are investing in the next big high revenue digital entertainment platform. It's a different group of people. But if the questioner wants to contact me afterwards, I can help direct them to places to go. But there are many people with capital available for cultural and arts projects and not just for-profit gaming. Vincent?
Yeah, I hear Vincent. I see Vincent nodding. Maybe do you want to add something?
No, I think Ian responded to that one well. So I fully agree with him.
I actually have a question for you, Vincent, because we were talking about the creative economy. Today, according to a Deloitte report that came out in May, so it's very recent, they said that 7% of total employment comes from creative economy, and that it could grow to 40% in 2030. So what does that mean for companies like yours? What are you working on to be part of this new creative economy? And also, what does it mean for social and cultural changes in the future? I find it rather frightening, honestly.
What frightens you the most? The fact that the creative industry has the potential of growing and becoming such a big contributor to...
I guess I'm worried about what's going to happen more with the traditional economy. Also, I'm a journalist. I find that maybe this creative economy is not going to be as serious as we are in a more traditional role. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I'm just from another generation, I guess.
Yeah. Look, I think, those forecasts, what will the world look like tomorrow is a hard one is always a hard one to be right. But I am a firm believer that, we are moving towards this trend where the ability to own and to create and own is fundamentally being changed, which makes it possible for more and more people to go out there and essentially build a business as a one-man person, which before was incredibly difficult because your audience might not have been close to you. And even if you got to connect with that audience, there were very little means of making money. And so to what Ian was saying earlier, he's absolutely right. Probably less than 5% of creators today are actually making enough money to make a living from it. And there's a very, very limited group of folks who make plenty of money. But we also have to realize that 10 years ago, most of those folks couldn't even imagine making money through what they did. So think of the first days of YouTube. People were posting, cat videos. They didn't think that, one day such a platform will allow them to actually make money, or that the creation of content, the capture and creation of content will allow them to do this. Now, if I tell my son or my daughter that, that was the way it was, they look at me and they go, why? It makes so much sense that you would be able to reach people. And the other thing that kind of, struck me is today there's different ways of monetizing. Some of it is, there is a recognition that there is value in the creative process, right? And people appreciate seeing different things and discovering different things. And you're not even forced in many of those platforms. You think of Twitch initially, streamers got tips. They weren't asking to get paid. There were platforms that were created who enabled viewers to suddenly give money. And you know what? You didn't even have necessarily the same level of social pressures that you would have when you're walking down the street and you have a musician playing the saxophone and everyone's giving a bit of money and you're like, oh, let me put some change, because you have the social pressure. You're doing it there for different reasons, but people are, this new generation does it voluntarily because they want to connect with someone that they really look up to. So look, this ecosystem is getting built, and the platforms that exist today are definitely not designed to put the creator first, but there are many new platforms and the whole ecosystem that enables people, creators, to actually monetize online, offline, give them the tools to manage their audience, their businesses in a way that was not feasible before. I don't think that the world is going to turn where everyone is going to be an independent creator making a living. But I do think that their influence in the world will be absolutely massive, and that they will, many of those kids who will end up getting a job. Maybe they'll be the next astronaut. Maybe they'll be, working as a writer in a company or a marketer or whatever, will have been born in a world where this concept exists and where they will have themselves as teens probably created content and tried it. And so the relationship and the mindset of, hey, I need to go through a middleman to connect with my customer, for instance, this very basic concept will now be fundamentally changed. And so there will be disruption from that perspective. Why do we need to go through a middleman? We should be able, as a company, just like individuals, connect directly with customers. So this is, we could spend the day talking about this, but I think the implication on the way the world works is going to be pretty massive, and it's going to hit it in different ways. I don't think creators are going to take over the world, but I do think that they will have a massive influence on the economy as a whole.
Okay, so I guess I'll have to get used to it. Ian, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I thought I'd connect both your concern about the seriousness disappearing and Vincent's thought about new platforms, because it's something that has a big impact on people who care about media, care about the entertainment space, and think about the polarization that's taking place politically. I won't spend too long on the politics, but you did say serious, so I'll do 2 minutes on serious. We've seen, partly because the platforms that exist for social media over the last 20 years survive principally on clicks, which means someone has to click on something to react, because that's the only way they get paid. In passive media of the past, whether it was television or a newspaper, you couldn't measure whether anybody looked at the ad. You couldn't measure if anybody was in the room watching when the TV ads came on between programs. So the advertisers paid you regardless, right? The advertisers paid for the advertising, even if they couldn't prove anybody was watching it. That's not true anymore. Now the advertisers will only pay if a click goes through, or if they can be sure that someone looked at the ad. Because of that, all of the news organizations and all of the general media organizations have to attract the advertiser more than they did before. So this leads to exaggerated clickbait. This leads to sometimes misleading headlines. This leads to also a polarization of the story. If you don't say it loud enough, if you don't say something interesting enough or provocative enough, you're worried people won't click. And so that's driven media all over the world, left and right in political terms. What that's done is left an empty space in the middle. So it will not surprise you to know that it may surprise you to know, my partner in Wired Magazine, Louis Rossetto, and I were together this weekend drinking good wine and too much good food, talking about that space and wondering whether that could be occupied by somebody. So without saying too much, because I'm reaching the end of my 2 minutes, I think Vincent's notion about new platforms may also lead to someone filling that middle space with a business model that doesn't rely on clickbait, exaggerated headlines, and might give you a slightly more reasonable, balanced view of the world, something we've missed, Muriel, you and I, since the demise of many of the great newspapers, and also the numbers watching traditional TV channels. So watch this space. I expect to see more occupying that middle space in the sort of serious news sector. I hope that will make you feel a little less worried, Muriel.
Wanted to ask Valentin if he had any more questions from our online viewers. Oh, sorry. Wait, before Valentin, we will take a question from the audience here in Istanbul. Do you need a microphone? There should be somebody coming with a microphone for you.
Thank you. Thanks. Hello. First of all, I would like to thank everyone for making today happen. And Vincent and Ian, thank you so much for sharing your valuable knowledge. I'm coming from more of an artist residency background, and I would like to ask 2 really short questions. The first is, in terms of an artist residency, what could an artist residency provide to creators? And secondly, the first is more on physical mobility and interactive and a more physical sort of an question. But then the second one is, how could a digital residency support creatives? Thank you.
Who wants to answer first? Ian, I see that your microphone is on, so go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't turn it off. I guess 2 thoughts come to mind. One is, one of the nice things about an artist residency, and I have friends who've been through them, is that you get a little bit of money for a while to explore an idea in conjunction with an institution. So you get the brand recognition that the institution has decided your work is worthy of sponsorship, because that's essentially what an artist residency is. It's sponsorship of a given artist. And you get a little bit of money and some time to work on a project. I still think that has all the relevancy that it used to have. I think those are wonderful things. I think it's a great way for particularly named institutions to support up-and-coming artists. And I'm sometimes involved in selecting and helping decide, particularly, by the way, in the digital space, where often some of the traditional supporters of artists and residents don't necessarily have the same exposure to the digital space. So I'm occasionally asked to advise. I would suggest that the same is true in the digital space. I'm surprised I haven't seen, or I'm surprised and not surprised that I haven't seen some of the bigger digital media platforms also take up the idea of an artist in residence, for example, for Twitch, for Facebook, for Snapchat, for any of the other platforms. I would have thought they should do. In a sense, they kind of do. Their feeling is that they give everybody a free access to the platform, and therefore everybody gets exposure. But the point of an artist in residence program is that the artist is actually given some money, which allows them to pursue an idea for a period of time. I would like to see that happen more from the digital platforms, in the same way that it already happens from museums and schools and universities and galleries in the physical world. I think it should happen more in the digital world. So I think the questioner, by the way, if she has ideas and projects, I would send them into places. Look online. I'm sure people are going to start thinking about it. I know, for example, that the museum that I'm talking to in the United States is looking at what digital residency means in the metaverse alongside what they do in the real space. So it is starting to happen now.
Vincent, did you want to add something? Otherwise, we'll take a question online.
Yeah, I'll quickly add one point, and it goes back to one of the comments as well that Ian mentioned earlier, which is, for any artists to be or creator to be successful is they should all take kind of a business course. And I think what's really fascinating is you look at the space and actually why this may be happening more and more, this question of residency or partnerships between creatives and enterprises, is that there's two things. The first one is I think creators today are actually probably more business savvy than the creators of the past, because everything is much more accessible. The transactions are immediate. You get to see what's working, what's not. You're born in a world where, because you're seeing what clicks, what doesn't click, you're already kind of, your creative process is influenced by the audience reaction. You're not working on this masterpiece that you then reveal and people look at it and go, I don't care, right? And so you're building that reflex as you do it. What's also interesting is, artists have always been huge drivers of cultures and trends. I think the creators are actually accelerating this because of the reach that they have, that they probably never had to that scale in the past. And so for companies, actually, it's becoming more and more common to have creatives in residence of all kinds, because it's a way to stay connected with the trends, with the subcultures that are actually driving what's cool and what's not. And so I think you'll see, and to Ian's point, I would definitely try and apply and reach out to many companies. You'll be surprised. It's about finding the right door in. But there's even, you're now starting to see, roles like entertainment officer or creative officers, which didn't exist before. And so there's definitely a recognition that this is an important part of any company.
Thank you. Valentin, you had a question, I think.
Yes, we do. Erin Rose is asking, if we look at games for newer studios, we are seeing many experienced folks creating studios by basically outsourcing, so not really building teams, and in many ways not teaching or sharing learnings to the next generation of game makers. It seems in many ways a reflection of the gig economy and everyone being an independent worker. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Okay, Vincent, you want to answer that? So are we being too individualistic, maybe not team workers as we should be?
Yeah, look, I think we've all been, I know I've been, for the past 18 months working remote and haven't been physically with other folks. And so I think there is already a shift in the world. And what do we mean by, being on the same team? Does it mean being, physically in the same space? So this notion of being part of something is evolved. And I see it even in the way, our teams work together. We have many people that have never met each other physically, and yet they've been working very closely. So is it that, do you need to be an employee to be part of a team? Is the learning, I think there are different models that are happening. And I'm sure, I don't think that's necessarily a new trend. It just makes it more accessible today. I'm probably, you would have to ask, one of the gaming studios how they think about the space and where they're hiring talent. But I can tell you that there's a shortage of those kinds of talents everywhere. And so if people have good talents working on games, they're going to be doing everything they can to keep them close would be my thought.
Ian?
Yeah, I agree that models are evolving, and Vincent's right. It's been interesting to see different companies react in different ways to the manner in which they keep some sort of team cohesion when they're separated out and maybe not quite as focused as they would be back home, but on the other hand, back in the office. But on the other hand, some people are more productive that way. So it's really a question of individuals and industries. I think specifically the question, the part of the question was talking about in-house training. I think that's a really important point. I'm hearing, by the way, I have heard over the last 12 months from friends of my daughters who work in different sectors that anybody who joined a job or company in this last year without actually going into a workspace, without meeting colleagues, without having any sense of the culture or how the company works, they've suffered. It's been really tough. I think, I remember I used to have a model when I was trying to build a company and opening the first overseas office. We always made sure that we brought someone in from the country we were going to plan to open an office in to spend 6 months minimum, but often as much as 2 years in our company at home base so that they understood the culture, learned how we were, knew names and faces so they could say hello and be relaxed around people before we would send that person plus someone else from the company back into their home country to open the subsidiary. I think teaching culture and teaching the way we do things around here and helping people learn what it's like to be part of our business culture, whatever our business culture is, I think is super important, particularly for the young. For those of us who've been in business a number of years, and especially if we've been working with the same colleagues for a period of time, distance doesn't hurt us, and sometimes it can help. But for those who are just starting and have no idea who anybody is or how it works, I think it's been an extremely tough year. So I have sympathies for the questioner. I think it's very important to bring people in so that they feel part of something before you send them out or before trying to make them work at a distance. Because I know young people who are already quitting jobs they started in the last 9 months because they felt they got nothing in terms of social relationships with the people they were supposed to be working with, and that's sad.
Are there any more questions from the audience here in Istanbul? No. Valentin, do you have another question? No? No more. Okay, because then I'll ask one last one. We're going to finish on that. You talked a little bit, Ian, about China, about the influence of China, what's happening now with limiting, screen time for the young kids with gaming. How important is China going to be in these new trends, and how are they going to work out the sort of controlling and this creative industry, which is totally uncontrollable?
So it's actually a very broad question, because I remember when I first started going to China around 2000, and actually before, my father was a journalist for the New York Times, and he was a China watcher, as they used to be labeled, literally a China watcher. That term came from standing on the border between Hong Kong and China and watching who came across the border. That's where that term came from. And he was a head of the Foreign Correspondence Club in Hong Kong for many years. So this questioning about the balance between control and creativity has always been there with China. There has been concern for many years that the learn by rote method of learning, creative talent, creative occupations within the university system in China was all about copying and not about encouraging expression and encouraging trial and error, encouraging making a mistake, because making a mistake, you get into real trouble in China. And yet they still come up with some of the most amazing innovations within the telecom space, within the computer gaming space itself, within many other sectors. So my short answer to the question is, referring a little bit back to my answer earlier, is I'm wondering how well they control this. I think all that happens is you drive it underground, right? Anything that's hugely addictive, and gaming is addictive, and coding is addictive, anything that's extremely addictive, if you make it illegal, it happens. It just happens in a place that no one can see, or at least the government can't see. And so I'm curious about how well China is able to control it. I am not worried about the ability of Chinese people in general and Chinese companies to generate innovation. I have seen it in my own eyes. We spent 8 years living in China. I do think there's going to be a struggle, and I do think some of the clear reasons why China has banned crypto is because they're about to issue their own digital currency and they don't want confusion in the marketplace. I understand that. They're also concerned from a social aspect, and corruption of youth point of view. They're concerned about the amount of time that children spend on games, and I would argue that there are countries in the West that would love to be able to pass such a law, but they would never be able to do it in our free economy. So it's not all bad. So I'm less pessimistic than some, more optimistic than most. But yes, it's going to be a difficult time for those two sectors, both crypto and gaming in China, and possibly, as I said, a worry for the creation of new gamers and new coders that generally come out of gaming communities.
So Vincent, you will have the last word. Your reaction?
Yeah, look, China's a force and is so big that, like Ian said, they're controlling the things that starts to stick out, but there are many things that aren't sticking out yet that are happening and that people just don't talk about or know about. And so I think for them, at the very top level, from what we see from the outside, you're going to see a lot of, the elements that seem like a lot of control. But when you're on the ground and you talk to, folks there's a tremendous amount of innovation, entrepreneurship. The number of things that get created, started, is really immense. And so I would distinguish what we hear from the outside, what you can see on the headlines, and what's happening physically on the ground. They move extremely fast. They have the numbers. So even if, it's not one, they're going to go at 10 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 trying to do the same thing. And one of them will break through. And when they break through, and we've seen it with the larger platforms, yes, the government does get involved, but they steer, right? And they steer based on their values and what they think is right for the market as a whole, in a way that is, foreign to us, coming from a different political system and a different value set. But they've proven that their methods have been very effective, and they've managed to do a lot of great things. So I would say, go on the ground. When you can go back on the ground, it's interesting to see what's happening there.
Thank you very much, Vincent. And thank you, Ian, for this very interesting talk, and thank you for answering all of our questions. And I want to thank you also for your participation and the people online who asked questions. So we're going to take a little break right now. For the people who are in this room here in Istanbul, you can go outside and you will be able to see the Bosphorus. It's going to be beautiful. For those who are online, you go to the virtual coffee room. You press on the button Coffee Room from your home page. Sorry, you have to make your own coffee. We don't provide it. So we'll see you back in 15 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.